Lars, you've been talking a lot about model uncertainty and how you can build uncertainty about the structure of the model or the structure of the world into economic models. And let's go a little bit outside of what people think of as economic models, even though I think economists would say everything's economics, but and that's to talk about climate change and the modeling of climate change. That's an area where there are a lot of models floating around. I think there are a lot of criticisms that those models are subject to an enormous amount of uncertainty, not just about uncertainty that the model recognizes, but uncertainty over what the model is. So it seems like an area ripe for the kind of approach that you've been thinking about.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I got into to some joint projects on this, thinking a little bit naively about how easy it would be to make really lots of productive progress on it. So I was talking before about these so-called long-run risk models, and so you think about, well, in the sense that really long-run risk got to be thought more broadly in terms of long-run uncertainty. And these models were just making up what the shocks were. That didn't really have very exciting names to them. And you think about, well, climate change, that seems like a fundamentally long-term uncertainty we're facing. And so maybe here's really important scope to actually add some real flesh to this whole discussion. And there's a very rich set of climate models out there, which I've only slowly been trying to learn about over time. The climate modeling community has a rather different culture than the economists. Economists, we often, are comfortable with our highly stylized models of the world, and we accept, lots of abstraction. The climate models are, most of them being used these days are very, very complex. I mean, in part, they want to get predictions not only over time, but across the whole globe and everything. And they're just loaded with complexities. They're models that take long times to solve, to analyze. They've got certain highly nonlinear impacts to them. And there's heterogeneity in their predictions across the models as well. To me, they still remain, big black boxes in certain that I can't fully conceptualize. But there's a huge community out there looking at these models, and I think that community recognizes that these models are imperfect. Even though they're big, complex, they're also evidence of them being systematically wrong in terms of some of their predictions, which I think, if you look at internal discussions among climate scientists, I think it would be certainly acknowledged and kind of understood. Now we want to take that type of modeling framework and transport it inside a really simple, tractable economic model. There's kind of some heroic steps you have to start taking there. First of all, there's uncertainty across these different climate models as to which is the better one. They don't, there's heterogeneity in their forecast. There's lots of even debates in climate science now about what the right way to simplify these complex models in terms of looking at connections between emissions and temperature and the like. These models are complex, but is there some simple way to characterize their implications? And there's discussions like that, which all seem to be tremendously important. But then the economist has to both hope to figure that part out, as well as then integrate it inside an economic model, and then go through and think about the right way to think about economic damages of the climate. This is just a hugely interesting and challenging problem to be doing. We can see lots of characterizations about how much uncertainty there are in the climate model predictions that should matter to economists across models, and not only evidence that all the models are systematically wrong in ways that climate scientists are still trying to figure out. And then we want to somehow treat that inside an economic model. Somehow the straight risk story just doesn't seem to cut the mustard anymore. We know the models used by economists are these very simplified approximations of these climate models, and climate scientists often don't like the simplifications economists are making. So it's an interesting tension between literatures here. But to me, it kind of really opens the door on a problem that's socially potentially important. When you talk about public policy, if people acknowledge uncertainty, I think there's a fear that if you acknowledge too much uncertainty, that they'll just be dismissed. The people who influence policy are those who project themselves with great confidence, who with pretense of knowledge that doesn't exist like that. And I think in this climate science area, there's a fear of acknowledging too much in terms of the weaknesses of the climate models and the climate economic models, for fear that it will just therefore lead us to no action, or we should just dismiss the whole enterprise, or just open the door to outside critics who say we should just do nothing. And that's not obviously the right answer. Remember, at the end of the day, if you think about it from an uncertainty perspective, it's just the possibility of there being serious consequences might be enough to tell you to act now. It may be much easier for us to impose a carbon tax now, even if we're not fully sure about the time, which we aren't, but the timing and climate impacts, than to wait later. And I think that trade-off between acting now versus waiting later to learn more about the climate is a very important one. But that's a fundamental question about uncertainty and how quickly we learn about things. So I view this as a first-order problem, and the fear I have is once we connect it to policy discussions, we start ignoring the degree of uncertainty for fear the whole enterprise will be dismissed.
I've tried to think about this problem, and I think the part that seemed to strike me, and I'm trying to see how this is related to how you think about it, is once you acknowledge that there is a lot of uncertainty over what the impacts are going to be, and a lot of that uncertainty extends over a long period of time.
Yeah.
It seems like some kind of certainty equivalent to a modest impact world or something would seem like it's such a poor approximation.
Yes.
That the kind of actions, not just the level of action, but the kind of actions you'd want to take would be extremely different.
Absolutely.
On the one hand, you say, well, geez, if something's going to happen 100 years from now, well, maybe I shouldn't care.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that's not always true. There's certain types of things that could happen 100 years from now, or could happen with some probability.
Yeah.
That something terrible that happens for sure in 1,000 years is very different than something that happens with a 1 in 1,000 probability every year, even though they kind of have the same expected time. I mean, they're incredibly different.
Yes.
One with a big impact rarely versus a small impact certainly. It seems to me that we ought to be talking about the uncertainty first and foremost as part of the approach we take.
Absolutely.
And if that really is the source of the loss that we potentially would suffer is very uncertain, there are certain policies that really won't make a difference and other policies that could help a lot that maybe the current debate doesn't seem to me even recognize. I mean, because when I hear about it, people say, well, carbon costs more than we thought it would, so let's just do something because carbon is more expensive. Yeah. Is that really likely to be the right policy response? I guess that's what I'm saying. Is it enough to say, well, let's put a price on carbon and walk away? Or is it really we should be thinking much more broadly about policy?
I would agree that we should think much more broadly about policy. It may be that the carbon tax is part of it, but
it doesn't seem like the right solution to me to sort of, it's like in the asset pricing world. It's like like you were saying, it goes back to, it seems to me it's tied back to your underlying work on macroeconomics. It's like we needed these variation in state prices to make the sense of the world. Yeah. And we need a lot of variation, and we needed those to change over time. Yeah. Isn't that same thing true? And
absolutely,
we kind of know we're starting there in the climate problem.
Yeah, I was just looking at the EPA website over the weekend, and they did this social cost of carbon calculation for different discount rates. And stuff like this drives me a little bit nuts, because what we know from asset pricing is that how you discount is state dependent. It's both horizon dependent, it's state dependent. Yeah. There isn't some number I can just feed through. And moreover, as you think about the potential damages of the climate, if you're really going to do a discounting type calculation, presumably I guess that would play some role in this. And is it the market discount rates we're after, or the social valuation? I mean, it's all those issues just get confused, just get lost in this discussion of trying to boil things down to simple numbers. And those adjustments are non-trivial. They can make huge consequences. This is a case where I just think there's lots of important questions to wrestle with. And I wish I knew all the answers right now, but it just seems to me you have to have an uncertainty perspective to really make headway in this problem.